Hi, everybody. My name is Rabbi Maurice Harris, and I work in the Department for Thriving Communities at Reconstructing Judaism. And I put together this narrated PowerPoint presentation, which I hope you will find helpful. I value your feedback and hope to hear from you. Thanks. How does a Reconstructionist approach to Judaism understand what God is? That's going to be the focus of this particular video. And it's intended as a general backgrounder for adults. Let's start by listening to some verses from a poem that was written by Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan, the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism, to get a little bit of a sense of how he thought about God. He wrote, "God is the oneness that spans the fathomless deeps of space and the measureless eons of time, binding them together in deed as we do in thought. God is the mystery of life, enkindling matter with inner drive and purpose. God is the creative flame that transfigures lifeless substance, leaping into ever higher realms of being, brightening into the radiant glow of feeling till it runs into the white fire of thought. God is in the faith by which we overcome the fear of loneliness, of helplessness, of failure, and of death. God is in the hope, which like a shaft of light cleaves the dark abysms of sin, of suffering, and of despair. God is in the love which creates, protects, forgives. In Reconstructionist approach to Judaism, we tend to imagine God as a power or a force, as a living process, as a part of nature, as a loving web of connection for all life. We tend to imagine God as the source, mysterious as it is, of all love, of all truth, of all daring and courage. We tend to imagine God both very intimately as a part of our innermost being, but at the same time as a cosmic mystery beyond our understanding. And all of that was kind of reflected in parts of Kaplan's poem. Finally, even though there's plenty of room to understand God in a variety of different ways in a Reconstructionist approach, one thing that's consistent is that we imagine that God is one. And that's something we have in common with all of the different approaches to Judaism. We understand God to be one, but that God is experienced through many different stories and teachings and metaphors. In Reconstructionist communities, some of the ways we don't tend to think about God, we don't tend to think about God as an old man in the sky on a throne. We don't tend to think about God as a supernatural being who breaks the laws of nature. So when you get stories like the splitting of the Sea of Reeds, a Reconstructionist approach is one that understands that story has been deeply important symbolically for our people for many, many centuries, but we don't really believe that something like that actually happened and that God does supernatural miracles. We have a much more naturalistic understanding of God. That kind of brings us easily to the next point, which is we don't tend to think of God as a being who literally does the things the Bible says God does. So, whether it's smiting people or sending a plague on people or causing the sun to stop in the sky in the middle of the day. These are things that we understand to be our ancestors' sacred stories, and we take these stories seriously and spiritually, but not literally. Another thing that's very distinctive, I think, about the Reconstructionist movement is that we don't tend to think of God as a being who favors any one religion or people over others. The Reconstructionist movement was the first movement to openly say we don't believe in the idea of chosenness. And if that's something that you'd like to know more about, that'll probably have to be for another presentation. But you'll see that our prayers in our liturgy have tended to replace traditional Hebrew language that refers to Jews as God's chosen people with other kinds of images. Okay, moving along. We don't tend to think of God as a being who dictated the Torah word for word to Moses, and who sort of revealed the Torah supernaturally from up high in the heavens down to us on earth. Rather, we understand the Torah and all sacred texts of all religions as created by human beings and as expressive of different human communities' attempts to understand God. Finally, we don't tend to think of God as a jealous, angry super being who rewards and punishes people based on their obedience. Which is not to say that we don't imagine that there's such a thing as right and wrong, or that there's spiritual and moral consequences to doing the right thing or the wrong thing. We do believe that, but we don't have the sort of supernatural God as a super being who punishes and rewards in that manner, really in our framework for understanding God. In a Reconstructionist approach to God, the big idea is to remember that everything in Judaism evolves over time, including how Jews understand God. That was kind of Mordecai Kaplan's major big idea, that to really understand Judaism as an evolving religious civilization, that all the major categories of belief and understanding, if you look at the long history of Judaism, that they've evolved and changed and adapted over time, and that that's beautiful, and that it's exciting to be a part of a community that gets to be the latest link in the chain of that evolution, that we get to participate in helping to shape what Judaism is becoming now as we study and understand all that it has been before. So what does that look like in terms of God? Well, if we start out with the writings from ancient Israel, from from our sacred texts, from the stories of Genesis and the Exodus and the prophets, in many ways we start out with ideas about God that are sort of depicted by these images that I've plucked off the internet. Kind of a fierce male deity who has a very strong sense of ethics, who commands people, who works miracles, and who rewards and punishes, and who is sometimes impossible to see or describe, but in other times is really a very personalized kind of God, which is why I threw in the bottom of these three pictures, which is an artist's rendition of Jacob in the book of Genesis wrestling God's angel, or depending on how you read that story, God's self. That story really describes in a direct encounter with God, where God sort of took on human form. We have all of those different kinds of images in the Hebrew Bible. And another really big image for our biblical ancestors about how they understood God was that God is a being up in the heavens, and that the right way to worship God involved building a temple and setting up an altar, and for people to make sacrificial gifts of grain and of livestock and of other valuables in an effort to stay close to God and to seek forgiveness and to maintain rituals that were pleasing to God. So all of that was an early form of how Judaism understood God and our relationship to God. Of course, all of that got disrupted a little right around 2,000 years ago, when the Roman Empire destroyed ancient Israel and destroyed the temple. And that put an end to sacrifices and to the biblical way of Jewish religious life. And that could have been the end of the story for us, but Rabbinic Judaism came along and reconstructed all of the major aspects of Jewish life and practice and belief. And one of the major things that Rabbinic Judaism did was it replaced the things that Jews did to worship God. Instead of bringing sacrifices to the temple, now the main things that we did to worship God were study the Torah and study the rabbis' interpretations of what's in the Torah. And that's why I have a picture of a page of Talmud featured now alongside a Torah scroll. And also to engage in prayer. So we see a whole lot of changes happen in the way that Jews relate to God, and in terms of the kind of God Jews believed in, there's some pretty big changes that happened around this time in Jewish history. One is that a lot of the rabbis really moved away from the idea of a personal God or a God who is kind of like a super being up in the heavens. And you start to see a lot more rabbis write about God as an abstract power, as a presence. You get rabbis arguing with each other about what God actually is. And for the most part, as long as they continued to believe that God was one, Judaism became known as a religion where people could have very different ideas about how they understand God. But in terms of what kind of God these people believed in, they believed in a God who not only gave the Jewish people the Torah, but who also created or inspired all of the rabbinic writings that came after the Torah, the Talmud and Midrash. And that's a major expansion of what Jews believed were the revealed texts and ideas of God. So if we move forward on the timeline, and we're pushing forward now all the way into the Middle Ages, we're going to start to discover that some of the more ancient understandings of God, which I am symbolizing with this particular image of the old man God in the sky, some of those ideas start to get challenged and replaced by the ideas of Greek philosophy. And what ends up happening is that Judaism adapts. It changes a lot of its theological ideas about God. It incorporates some of the ideas that come out of Greek philosophy and implements them in a couple of different ways, including in Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. I'm not going to do a quick explainer on what medieval theologies about God were like and what they looked like for the famous Rabbi Maimonides and what they looked like for the early Jewish Kabbalists. I'll just say this much. This was an approach to understanding God that absolutely rejected the idea of any kind of personal God. The God of these Jews is purely a force and an energy, and it is beyond words. It cannot be explained. For the mystics, it's an energy that flows through all kinds of levels of reality. But by and large, what you see in medieval times is more and more Jews moving away from images of God that are personal or personified. And what they do with all the stories in the Hebrew Bible that picture God like a giant man who's mighty and who's, punishing these people and doing miracles and praising these other people. What they do is they start saying all that is metaphorical. That's what they just openly say. They're just like, oh, no, we weren't supposed to take any of that literally. All metaphor. So just so you know that by the time you're going to get all the way to our time and place, we are not the first ones to be developing and changing and helping Jewish ideas about God evolve. We are just the latest ones to be doing that. In a Reconstructionist approach to trying to understand God, if we listen to the advice of Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan, he would say that the starting point for us should be our tradition, should be Torah and Talmud and Midrash and all of our sacred texts and teachings, and it should also include a careful study of how Jewish beliefs about God have evolved from one era to the next. So that's our first order of business, according to Kaplan, is to study all of those things. And once we've learned a lot about those things, then we're ready to have all that information come into contact with things that we learn and experience in our own lives. Kaplan thought that that dynamic meeting place of where people bring their authentic selves and experiences into dialogue with Jewish teachings and tradition, that was the place where the sparks happen and Judaism continues to evolve. So he asked that after we became knowledgeable about our sacred texts and our Jewish ideas and how they've evolved, that we should then also seek to learn from other sources of knowledge, from the sciences and the natural world, from the best insights and values from other religions and nations and belief systems, from the truth of our own lived experiences, and from the wisdom that emerges from study and discussion together. Kaplan's famous quote about Jewish tradition was that the past has a vote, not a veto. And that's really important. The past has a vote, and it's a crucial vote. There is no reconstructing Jewish ideas about God without first learning what past ideas about God have been for Jews. But once we've done that studying and brought our own experiences and the best ideas around us to bear on the conversation, then we get to discuss with each other, and hopefully together we come up with new beliefs and ideas that help us understand God. Throughout our prayer book series, wherever God's name appears in Hebrew, actually specifically wherever the Yud He Vav He version of God's name appears in Hebrew, the prayer book editors constantly changed up the metaphor, partly so that we wouldn't get too attached to any one metaphor, but also partly to make the point that part of what we're talking about is completely beyond words. So you can see an example of that here on this slide. And if we look at another page, you can see in the course of just one prayer on one page, we have metaphors like the Almighty, the One, the Fount, the Divine, the Mysterious, all kinds of glimpses at something that is within us, that is an energy and power that motivates and moves us, to be courageous, that moves us to be loving, that is the source of all life in the universe, and yet is completely beyond words. For sure, trying to work with a complex understanding that's also rich and deeply spiritual about God is not the easiest thing to communicate directly and easily as a religious school teacher. So we'll talk about that challenge in another video soon. Meanwhile, thank you so much for taking this time. Shalom.